turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
Questions. Research.
technology. Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to The Naked Scientists. This is the show where we bring you the latest breakthroughs in science, technology and medicine with me, Chris Smith. Coming up today, what the COVID app that at least 18 million people used in the UK across the pandemic has revealed about how diseases spread. The first proper peer-reviewed analysis of the data has now been published. Also, AI boosts productivity for writers, but it makes stories more samey, scientists say. So are we willing to trade boring for productive? And former Science Minister David Willetts on the appointment of Sir Patrick Vallance to his old job in government.
From Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, this is The Naked Scientists.
First this week, during the height of the recent coronavirus pandemic, we were urged to install the government's COVID-19 app on our mobile phones, which would ping to notify us that we'd been in close proximity to someone who had the virus. Many were concerned about the app on a number of levels, including encroachment on personal liberties, but statistical analysis of the data it collected is beginning to reveal fascinating insights into the dynamics of how that disease spread during that period, and the role that digital contact tracing might play during a future pandemic. Michelle Kendall is from the Department of Statistics at the University of Warwick.
The NHS COVID-19 app was brought in September 2020 in order to try to alert people when they were at high risk of being infected with COVID and allow them to be able to take appropriate precautions. And we've been able to show that it was effective in reducing the number of cases, reducing the burden on the NHS, and in fact saving lives. We estimate that in its first year, it saved 10,000 lives. What we realised while we were looking at the data was that it was also actually revealing some really important, useful information about the epidemic that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to measure.
How did it actually work, that app?
What it did was it worked anonymously in the background in a privacy-preserving way. And all it did was just measure little low-energy Bluetooth signals between phones which had the app. And if two phones had come in close contact shortly before somebody reported testing positive for COVID, then it could anonymously alert the other person that they'd been near to someone with COVID recently enough to be at high risk.
But how many people actually installed that at peak? Because with all kinds of stats and that kind of thing, it all comes down to the power of a study which is driven by the numbers.
Yes, so we're really grateful. We actually, at the peak, had 18 million users, which was a phenomenal engagement with a new technology. And that meant that the app was able to be super accurate, in particular in sort of spring, summer 2021. We had lots of users, unfortunately, lots of COVID as well. And so people being pinged by the app, being told that they might be infected, were at peak times up to 100 times as likely to be infected as the general population.
What did this enable you to probe that we couldn't tell about epidemics and the pattern of spread of diseases and outbreaks and so on before this came along?
So it gave us a really good window into how much people were meeting up, how many contacts people were having, and then when they were having those contacts, how likely they were to pass on an infection. The new things that we were able to do with this were that it was available straight away. We could find out the very next day how much people were meeting up. And in particular, it was specific to the very people who were infectious with COVID at the moment. So it doesn't really matter how much people are meeting up if they've not got COVID. It's the ones who are currently infectious that matter for the spread of the disease. And the app data was uniquely reporting on that. Coupled with that, you could see how likely the infections were to be passed on. So we saw that likelihood decrease as the vaccination rollout came out. And then we saw that probability increase again when the Omicron variant arrived.
Could you also see the effect of the different interventions? Because one of the big questions that kept rearing its head across the pandemic was governments would implement some kind of control policy, But it wasn't evidence-based at that time because we just didn't know. We had to assume that face masks would help, or not going into a shop more than 3 people at a time would help. Can you map any changes in the patterns you were seeing in the app onto policy decisions in England and Wales where this was running to try to work out the relative effectiveness at the time of those sorts of interventions?
Yes, we can. So early on in the pandemic, you may remember a lot of interventions sort of came piling in on top of each other. We had rules of 6 and pub closures and all sorts all happening in the same week. And of course, it's hard to disentangle that. But a particular window where we do have good data was in early 2021. You may remember in the UK, we had a roadmap out of lockdown with various steps of reopening, which each came at least 5 weeks apart. And because they were nicely spaced out, we were able to see what was happening. And in particular, we could see that it didn't have much effect on how much people were mixing through steps 1 and 2 of reopening. And then step 3 was the really big one when people mixed a lot more. In fact, step 4, which was billed as the final reopening, didn't make all that much difference to how much people were meeting up. So yes, we could get that sort of data. And I think that the point to highlight here is that for the future, this could be really powerful. If we roll this out in a future epidemic, then this could be integrated in the policy making so that you're getting real-time feedback on your interventions and much more power to carefully balance those interventions, because obviously the interventions have harms, the disease has harms, and you want as much quantifiable data as you can to be able to balance those harms.
What are the implications then? Does this mean that if we do see COVID Mark 2, heaven forbid, turn up next year, or we get the next flu pandemic, we know one will be coming at some point, that basically the government will be in a much stronger position because they say, well, we already have a sort of platform, we know it can work and we know we can trust the data. Are these the sorts of messages that you're distilling out of what you've found?
Absolutely, yes, and that's the reason that we've taken our time to do this analysis really carefully and get it peer reviewed so that we can prove just how effective this is and hopefully motivate the development of digital technologies like this, because it could be so powerful not only for reducing the actual burden of the disease, but for getting a window into, as you say, how the interventions are working and how effective they can be, and targeting those interventions. The other category of data we got was about the days of the week. We could see the variation that the virus got spread much more on Saturdays than other days of the week. The settings, how long people were in contact for, differences between regions even, and the effects of particular moments. So we looked at Christmas Day, New Year, and the Euro 2020 tournament, which was held in 2021. And we're getting really specific information about exactly the effect of all those different things that come together to affect the spread of disease.
It's been Euro time again. Do these sorts of mass gatherings make a big difference? And is Taylor Swift off the hook? Because people have been pointing the finger at her for her $1 billion worldwide tour as causing a bit of a spike in COVID numbers in the UK. I'm sure it's just an association, not causation. Do these sorts of mass gatherings really provoke big outbreaks?
Great question. Well, the app has been decommissioned now, so we can't learn anything from the data about Taylor Swift, unfortunately. The signal we got about the Euros was that, yes, match days were associated with really steep spikes in cases. Transmissions were up to 7 times higher than on non-match days, even in the middle of the week. And the final itself saw a huge spike in cases. And so, yes, stadium gigs may be something to look at, but also when there is sort of coordinated gathering, I think that's a real driver of spread. But certainly it was for COVID in the context that we were looking at.
So while we didn't pick up the silver in 2021, a lot of us probably did pick up COVID that day. That was Michelle Kendall at the University of Warwick, and the study she was describing has just come out in the journal Science. Hurricane Beryl, the first in this year's Atlantic season, has wreaked havoc across the Caribbean and the United States. The US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, however, has warned that worse may be yet to come. NOAA, as it's known, has predicted that the region could have as many as 7 major hurricanes this year, which is 3 more than it would normally do on average. So what's driving this uptick in hurricanes and their earlier arrival? Well, Helen Hooker is a meteorologist at the University of Reading.
A hurricane is a tropical storm. It entails extremely strong winds, so we can categorise hurricanes from 1 to 5. Category 1 begins around 74 miles an hour.
When do they tend to happen and where?
They're known as hurricanes in the tropical Atlantic and the tropical Pacific. They tend to happen from around August time, and then they peak September, October time.
And why that timing?
One of the main drivers of forming tropical cyclones or hurricanes is a warm ocean, generally above 26 degrees or so. Normally, it takes the length of the summer for the seas to warm up, and this really gives the energy that can then generate the formation of hurricanes.
I was going to ask you that. So what's actually going on? What is that warm water doing to drive the development of the hurricane?
To develop a hurricane, you usually need two main drivers. So you need kind of energy from beneath, and then something else that's going to cause uplift to kind of suck up the air from above. So we have these things called waves that are high in the atmosphere, and this can cause this uplift. And then at the same time, if you have a warm ocean, this is going to warm up the air above the ocean, and then this air rises. The pressure would then drop at the surface, and this low pressure then draws in more and more air, and this air is kind of coming in and lifting, and then it becomes a big cycle. So it's kind of self-sustaining.
Presumably also because it's warm, it's going to be very humid, so there's going to be a lot of water going up as water vapour with that rising warm air.
Yeah, exactly, which is why we associate extremely heavy rainfall with hurricanes.
What then determines how powerful that hurricane ultimately becomes?
It's the combination of that updraft and kind of drivers from above, and the temperatures of the ocean is quite key. We've seen this year that the temperatures have been extremely warm very early in the season in the tropical Pacific, so they're about 3 to 4 degrees warmer than usual. And so this really gives ideal conditions for this kind of rapid intensification of hurricanes where they form really, really quickly. So Hurricane Beryl went from just a usual tropical storm to a Category 4 hurricane in around about 42 hours, which is incredibly rapid intensification.
Does this mean then that climate change, rising sea surface temperatures and so on, are likely to make this happen on this sort of scale or greater more often?
There are regional variations in the expectations of how hurricanes will change in the future. It's likely that hurricanes are becoming more intense, so we're likely to see more of the stronger major hurricanes, but not necessarily a higher frequency overall. But I think this is still a very active area of research, and I think the general frequency is still very much under debate.
Helen Hooker from the University of Reading.
The Naked Scientists podcast is produced in association with Spitfire, cost-effective voice, internet and IP engineering services for UK businesses. Find out how Spitfire can empower your company at spitfire.co.uk.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound, perfect music for audio and video productions.
You're listening to The Naked Scientists with me, Chris Smith. Still to come, does AI boost productivity at the cost of creativity? We will find out. But first, the UK's new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has been announcing the lineup of ministers who will sit in the senior positions in his government. And the list includes several experts who aren't politicians, which has certainly raised a few eyebrows. One surprising appointment is the Science Minister post, Patrick Vallance. Sir Patrick became famous during the COVID-19 pandemic when he was the UK government's chief scientific advisor. His appointment is the first example of a former chief scientist going on to become a cabinet minister for science. To find out what this might mean and what challenges will confront Patrick Vallance in his role, we put in a call to Lord David Willetts, who served in the equivalent role under David Cameron from 2010 until 2014. He's now president of the Resolution Foundation and chairs the UK Space Agency.
Well, first of all, I think it's fantastic that Patrick Vallance has got the job. I think he has the potential to be one of the really great science ministers, and I wish him well. And I think it's a very imaginative idea having the former chief science advisor, now the chief science decider as the science minister. There's an appetite, and we've heard this from Tony Blair this week, for using science and tech to deliver better quality public services without having public expenditure going up. That's the AI agenda. There's increasing interest amongst the security people in the dual use of so much science and tech and how you protect our national capabilities and our sovereignty by ensuring that, be it in a crisis like COVID or a crisis potentially in international relations post-Ukraine, the UK has got the sovereign capabilities it needs. And then you've got the Treasury with growth and getting growth going as a high priority. All of those have science as a key input. In a nice, even world, everything would be complementary with everything else. But sometimes there are tough decisions to be taken about priorities and the allocation of resources and how you balance all that out, given you've actually got quite a tight science budget. I think that'll be a big question that, with his expertise and background, he's very well placed to tackle.
When people saw that Patrick Vallance had been appointed, a lot of them said to me, I mean, obviously there's a certain crowd I tend to mix with, isn't it interesting that we now have a scientist, or at least someone who's come from a medical and an industry, biomedical industry background, pharmaceuticals, and has also functioned as the government's chief scientific advisor and is now in that role. Do you think that will be an advantage, or do you think someone like yourself who came from an arts background, that was an advantage too, because you don't tend to carry any of the scientific baggage, you come with a less biased mindset towards the sciences?
I don't believe you always need to be kind of literal minded about this. So I don't think the Home Secretary needs to be an ex-police officer, and the Defence Secretary needs to be an ex-soldier, and the NHS should be run by a doctor, and the science budget and the science department has to have a scientist at its head. So I don't think we always need to be literal minded about this, because there are democratically elected politicians moving around. However, I do think Patrick has got some very special skills. First of all, he has been at the heart of government at a time of intense crisis with COVID. He has probably spent longer in contact with ministers inside Number 10, inside the Cabinet Office, than any other scientist, and a lot more than probably many other ministers in the government. So he has actually seen public policy close up. He is not arriving as an ingenue, he's arriving with a deep experience of it. And he's also, of course, got a business background, having been with GSK. So he has got a lot of relevant experience. And then secondly, if it were a highly politically charged, controversial area, it would, I think, be a lot tougher. However, I think one of the good things is that science and research, it should be one of those areas where there is a pretty high level of cross-party consensus. I certainly support Patrick and very much want to see him succeed. So he himself is bringing a lot of relevant experience, and it's an area where I don't expect there to be highly fraught party political debates, which would make life trickier for him.
He's not an MP, Member of Parliament. So how does it work with his appointment? How has he got this cabinet job?
He's going to join the House of Lords, and we had in the last Parliament David Cameron as Foreign Secretary in the House of Lords. And I have to say, I think the idea of Patrick standing up at the dispatch box at the House of Lords and then facing questions from Martin Rees and John Krebs and Julia Brown, I think it's all going to be fantastic. I think they're going to be some of the highest level, most sophisticated exchanges we'll have seen in the British Parliament, and we can look forward to them. But meanwhile, of course, the Secretary of State, Peter Kyle, will be in the House of Commons, and there will also be an opportunity, quite rightly, for the Democratic Chamber, for MPs to ask the Secretary of State, who will still have overall responsibility. So I think it can be made to work.
Maybe a slightly naive question on my part, but when you have someone who is coming via the House of Lords, like Patrick Vallance, not as an elected MP standing on behalf of a specific party. I don't know Patrick's politics, but is it possible that he could vote Conservative but end up as a member of the Labour cabinet because of his scientific credentials and value he can bring to the present government? Could that happen? And could that indeed be the case?
What he will be bound by is collective responsibility. So if there are votes in the House of Lords on government policy across the whole waterfront, then I'm sure he'll be expected to vote as a government minister in favour of government policy. So he will be bound by collective responsibility now, I expect, and that's how it should be. Politics is ultimately a team sport. You can only achieve what you try to achieve in politics if you're part of a team. It's one of the paradoxes of politics. All these people in politics are all individualists. They're temperamentally tennis players and runners, and they find themselves playing football or rugby. Individualists in a team sport is what makes politics so fascinating.
Former Science Minister Lord David Willits. Thanks, David. More and more of us are using generative AI, things like ChatGPT, to help us out on a daily basis. It can be very helpful in carrying out tasks we'd rather not do ourselves, but new research has found that it may also diminish our creativity. Anil Doshi at University College London and Oliver Hauser at the University of Exeter are behind the study, and I've been speaking to them.
So when we first heard about this new technology, generative AI, which is really a very powerful, potentially powerful technology that allows you to generate content at the click of a button, when this came onto the scene about 2 years ago, we got very excited to ask, how would that actually affect how people think about creative problems, and would it make them more creative in solving some of those problems, maybe become a bit more creative in writing and expressing themselves?
Creative or productive, Oliver? Because people have argued that both could happen. It could unlock our creativity and make us do new things. Or on the other hand, it might just mean we do the old stuff faster.
I think both is possible. We didn't go in with a particular hypothesis saying one or the other, but we did think creativity, which is so fundamental to a lot of activity in the economy, whether that's being a writer, whether it's being a scientist, or whether it's somebody who just innovates something completely new, creativity is fundamental to that. And we didn't focus on the speed at which it's done, but how creative and novel it would be.
How did you do it, Anil? What was actually the experimental method?
So we run an online experiment using participants from an online source. We wanted to target a wide variety of people with different skills. And we asked them to write a short 8-sentence story. So it's a written task. So you can imagine we asked something like, write a story about an adventure on a different planet. And what we do is we randomly assign our writers into one of 3 conditions. So in the human-only condition, we have them only have the writing task and the text box to write their story. And then we have 2 AI idea conditions where they can ask for a 3-sentence idea for a story. And so in the first condition, they can ask for one of those ideas. And in the second of the AI conditions, they can ask for up to 5 of those AI ideas. And the reason why we have 2 AI conditions is it was not clear to us before the fact whether one idea could kickstart your creative process, or having multiple ideas would either further boost your creativity or create kind of a muddled situation where you're getting too many similar ideas from AI. So we have these 3 conditions, and our writers are randomly assigned into one of these 3 conditions. And then we pass those stories on to a set of third-party evaluators who are not told whether or not the writers got AI assistance. And we ask them to evaluate the story on a variety of measures, 2 particularly related to creativity. One dimension was novelty, and the other was usefulness, which essentially is the story up to task. Is it useful for the purpose of being a story for young adults? Along with a number of other dimensions of writing quality, emotional responses, whether there's a plot twist and things like that. So we have these outcomes from the third-party evaluators, and we also use natural language processing techniques to assess how similar the stories might be to one another in each condition.
And Oliver, did it help having access to AI? Were they more creative, more productive? Did you get better results?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, better comes in a variety of different ways. So I would say a little bit yes and a little bit no. The yes means, in the sense that we have on the outcomes that Anil described, we find that on novelty and usefulness, people score on average a little bit higher. And that is, good for that individual because they have a little bit more creative stories. We also find they're a bit more well written, a little less boring, and have a plot twist. However, just because on an individual level, the stories are a little bit more creative, doesn't mean it's all good. Because when we think about a collective, which means we look at everything that's been produced in this study, we can make another analysis, and that allows us to look how similar are these stories to each other. And if you think back, in one condition, people only had access to one AI or to five AI conditions. But as soon as they had access to any AI condition, we find those stories become more similar to each other, which means that we don't have as much novelty in this group of people and potentially in society once they are anchored on the ideas that AI is giving them. Whereas if you think about the human only condition, it's different. It's that the ideas are a bit more varied, they're less similar to each other. They may not always be as good, but they certainly have a bit more variety and diversity.
These were just members of the general public, weren't they, Anil? So would this be the same if we did this with professional writers? If you took Charles Dickens and set this task for him, do you think he would be aided and abetted by AI? Or do you think actually if you took a professional, they would in fact end up doing what Oliver's saying and converge on very similar kind of things because their thoughts might be biased by the AI in a less creative and less novel direction?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. I'm certainly not going to put Charles Dickens on the spot here. I'm sure he would still excel in his written output. But what we do in the experiment is we are able to get a measure on how inherently creative each writer is. And since these were members of the general public, we have writers who are inherently less creative and writers who are inherently very creative. What we find is this boost in creativity that Oliver was speaking about accrues essentially to the people who are the least creative. And it accrues to them in a way that it makes their stories evaluated as being as creative as the most creative people in our sample. We don't find, however, that the creativity boost accrues to the most creative of our writers. So it has this kind of leveling of the playing field effect that we saw.
I was going to say, as you were talking, it feels a bit like a sort of levelling up. It brings up the floor, but it doesn't take up the ceiling.
We don't observe it improving most creative writers in our sample. Now, obviously, we would encourage follow-on work to think about that in more detail because we're at the first stages here of understanding how AI can benefit in various forms and flavors. So we don't find that effect, but whether it's possible remains to be seen.
What do you think the implications of this are, Oliver, more broadly? Do you think it's going to be just relevant to creative writing and people churning out short stories? Or do you think you can extrapolate what you find here to other applications of generative AI and we might be pushing ourselves into a sort of corner with AI in this way because it's basically using the sum total of human creativity to train these systems. So unsurprisingly, it gives us back what we've already created and we do end up without much novelty.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's so hard to extrapolate a lot from just one study. So that's something to just take as a starting point. We're one of the first studies to look at creativity, but there's more and more coming every day. And it will fill up the picture a bit more to see where this is heading. But I would say we are certainly a little concerned about the fact that, if people have an incentive individually to use AI, and if that incentive leads them to use it more, but the output is, well, it's a little bit more creative for them, they might feel like this is a good thing, I'll keep using it more. But if as a whole in society we start having less creative output, less diversity of novel ideas, it could actually not help our progress going forward with new ideas, new innovations, new writing, right? Like some of these ideas, even though we think of them, looking back at history, we can now recognize just what amazing outliers they were. It's not straightforward to get those. And I think we don't want to anchor our ideas on what has been previously produced by some generative AI. And so I think there's a risk. There's a risk that we don't end up in such a diverse world of novel ideas. But whether that's going to be in the future, I think is really something to be studied more.
What do the creators themselves think, Anil? Because I know some people are a bit sniffy about using these kinds of things, and they feel that perhaps their art, their creative art, their journalism is less high quality because a computer's doing a chunk of it for them. It's a bit like saying I'm not going to use a word processor, I'm going to stick to my typewriter or my stone tablet. But do people find that they feel that it's less authentic if a computer's helped them in this way?
That's an interesting question. I'll answer that in two ways. First of all, from the writer's point of view, we asked the writers kind of where did your idea come from for their short story? And the folks who got AI assistance, even though they got the AI assistance, they would always kind of give themselves a little bit of credit as well. So they said, well, the first spark of the idea was from the AI, but really it was my idea and my development. So there is kind of this ownership aspect that you alluded to. And from the evaluator's point of view, what we find is that evaluators tend to be okay if writers are using the AI assistance, but they definitely attributed a discount in terms of how much ownership does a writer, quote unquote, deserve if they were getting AI assistance.
I wonder if that will translate into a wage cut from editors to the people who write their radio programs and their newspaper copy.
I don't want to speculate on that, but I do worry about content creators in general.
Absolutely fascinating. Neil Doshi there from UCL and Oliver Hauser at the University of Exeter. They were talking about why AI can be good for doing average work more quickly, but it won't necessarily raise the bar. Well, talking of raising the bar, now it's time for Question of the Week, which certainly will. And Will Tingle has been getting to grips with an inquiry sent in by listener Phil.
What makes up the space when subatomic particles move to a different place in space? Is it a void? Good question, Phil. Alan on the forum chimes in with a good point. He says yes, or at least from the point of view of the particle. The physics model that we use uses interaction cross-sections of different particles and media. The cross-section for neutrino to anything, for example, is so small that the neutrinos universe consists of almost entirely empty space. But if we look at an atomic structure, the electrons on the periphery are whizzing around in a sort of cloud. But they can't be all places at all times, even if they do travel at the speed of light. So what, if anything, makes up the empty space in their momentary absence? Well, regrettably, the answer is quantum physics. Fortunately, we have the University of Cambridge's Ben Alanak to talk us through it.
Well, there is something in apparently empty space, actually, because no space is completely empty. If you look at it at the smallest distance scales, quantum field theory tells you that every species of particle has a kind of quantum jelly, let's call it, associated with it, which fills the entire space. When there's a ripple in this jelly, there's a small, spatially small ripple. That's where we would measure a particle there. So if there's an electron jelly, for example, throughout all space, when there's a localized ripple in that electron jelly, that's where we would measure an electron. And every particle species has one of these. And if you have moving ripples, if the ripples move along the electron jelly, they will tend to excite ripples in the photon jelly. And so what we understand then is that moving electrons tend to produce particles of light, photons. This is a big old complicated theory, but what happens is when you look at the tiniest distance scales, all of these jellies actually are all wobbling about and being very unruly. So they're all sitting on the kind of background space and time.
You're saying that when there isn't, say, a subatomic particle filling a space, there is still this almost four-dimensional net, this quantum field that holds stuff together.
It's like the potential. You can just think of it as the potential for a particle to be there. And then when there's a ripple in it, then you've got a good probability of the particle being there.
Big thanks to Phil for the question and Ben Alanak for the answer. Next time, we're answering a question from listener David, who asks, can you extract DNA from fossils? Good question, and we'll be digging into that one next time.
And if you think you know the answer or you've got a question of your own, then why not drop us a line and help us out? It's chris@thenakedscientist.com. Or you can pop into our forum at nakedscientist.com/forum, where this and many of our previous questions are being discussed. And that's all we have time for this week, but do join us on Tuesday when Titans of Science continues with the atmospheric chemist Susan Solomon. She was one of the first people to recognise the significance of the hole opening up in the ozone layer. The Naked Scientist comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education. It is supported by Rolls-Royce. I'm Chris Smith. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.